So we'll take Nancy Taaffe, who's TUSC candidate in was a TUSC candidate in the GLA elections and library worker made redundant through the cuts, and then Isabel afterwards.
Well, thanks for inviting me tonight. I'm a member of the Socialist Party, and the Socialist Party for quite some time now has been putting forward the idea of standing working class candidates outside of the Labour Party, of having an electoral platform which challenges the new Labour neoliberal agenda. This morning we were leafleting our local hospital because I don't know if people know, it was on the news last night that Barts is about to suffer terrible cuts, and this is linked to the PFI projects which many of the East London hospitals signed up to in the 90s. And the very first time I stood electorally, I stood against Neil Gerard, who for many inside the Labour Party is considered a very good so-called left MP. And at that time it was under the Tories, I think, originally, and we were talking about PFI, about the position of PFI. And I remember in that meeting Neil Gerard arguing that PFI was the only show in town, and that was the only way we were going to get money to regenerate the health service after the years of Thatcher and the Tories. And I remember it was the Socialists in the room, the Socialist Party members in the room, saying to him, this is debt for future generations and will lead to terrible cuts, job losses, etc. And this morning, standing in the pouring rain outside the hospital, it was at 6:30 in the morning. I haven't had much sleep. I was up with the storms and then up on this leaflet in the hospital this morning. And coming away, I was thinking about that meeting. I was thinking it was a long time ago. I think it was it 1992, was it originally? A long time ago, having that discussion with our local Labour MP, and now facing terrible cuts to our local hospital, a hospital where I had both my children in, where there's a photo of me in my room of my baby son sitting on my lap with a sign behind me saying, keep this ward open. We fought every cut, every privatisation. There's a lively unison branch of that local hospital, and now we're really involved in the fight of our lives to defend the wholesale murder, if you like, of the NHS. And I'm very pleased that I can say that even as far back as under the Tory government, we recognised that PFI would be mortgaging our children's future. And also I remember outside that hospital of standing there and speaking on a platform when the Darcy report was released in London, which led to another wave of cuts. Now this was under a Labour government, this wasn't under a Tory government, this was under a Labour government. And I remember I was up to speak, and I actually spoke behind Ian Duncan Smith, who's the Chingford MP, who'd come along opportunistically under a Labour government to say that he was opposed to health cuts and that we should all support the Tories because they were in opposition. And this morning, as we were being rained on, we walked away from the hospital as we'd given our leaflets out. I thought, we've got to get off this merry-go-round. We've got to get off this political merry-go-round which allows any opportunist, careerist individual to come along and use the opposition movement to cultivate their own position in order to win a nice seat in Parliament or in the council. And I think what distinguishes TUSC from perhaps some of the other campaigns, because I've been to a lot of meetings that discuss working class representation and the lack of it. At the start of this year, we decided, we had a TUSC meeting in Waltham Forest, and we decided that we were going to aim to try and stand the maximum amount of candidates in the borough in 2014. In 2014, we've got council elections. There's 60 positions up for grabs in Waltham Forest, and we would attempt to try and put up candidates in our borough, which is a pretty tall task. So what I've been doing is I've been going to people's workplaces, arranging to meet with them in cafes and in staff rooms, and discussing with them perhaps about them adding their name to this list, to register an interest of being a potential candidate in 2014 of completely bypassing, if you like, the official structures, trying to make links with good stewards, good activists, bedroom tax campaigners, people on the ground who are there struggling day in and day out, and meeting with them to discuss the possibility of them standing on a list in 2014. And it's been really interesting being involved in this work, but also one of the things that's quite shocking is when you pose quite directly to people the possibility of them standing. It's almost like the ugly duckling, where they say, me, a swan? Oh, go on, there's no way that I could possibly stand on this list. And then when you go through all the work that they've done, who are the natural heirs to the anti-cuts, anti-austerity programme? It is precisely these people. And once you start discussing with them about representing yourself, standing yourself, then we're getting a better echo from people. In 2014, there were 1,800 council seats in London. There are 32 boroughs, and there are four elected mayors. Now, we're toying inside TUSC of opening up a link, if you like, on our website. It's not agreed, but of advertising across London and appealing to the very same people that exist in Waltham Forest, appealing to those people in Brent and in Haringey and in Hackney. I mean, I spoke at a meeting in Hackney about 3 months ago, packed meeting, where we had the Turkish Community Centre who were agreeing to canvass for candidates, agreeing to put forward people to stand. We've got a couple of resident associations, tenants associations, mainly Afro-Caribbean activists who are looking to stand under the umbrella of TUSC. And I haven't discussed the cuts generally. I've been concentrating my remarks on how essential I think this sort of work is. I think it's absolutely essential now that activists go out into the communities and boldly ask people around them, people who've been involved in campaigns, whether they will add their names to this list. Because why is it so important? We could be campaigning against cuts like we've done over the last 10 or 15 years, and then we let those people who we know are going to betray us back into power. And I think we're, as the previous speaker said, as Helen says, we're duty bound to try and prevent that from happening. We've already got splits and fissures that have developed inside the Labour Party. If I'm correct, you had Kingsley Abrams in Lambeth, who originally voted against cuts, and I think through his sins was suspended from the Labour Party for voting against cuts. We've had the position of the Southampton councillors. Well, originally, for people who don't know, TUSC stood candidates in Southampton in the local elections, and actually we were lambasted for it. We were condemned for standing candidates in Southampton. We were told by the Unison officials that we were splitters, that we all had to get behind the local Labour Party, and for TUSC to put up candidates, then we would be diverting the issues. But we stood candidates in Southampton, and we raised the programme of no cuts. We didn't get a good vote, but we raised the programme on the estates, in the communities, in the shopping centres. And then when the Labour councillors were faced with cuts inside Southampton over the closure of a local swimming pool, all hell broke loose. The point I'm trying to make is we had to stand those candidates in order to raise the profile of the anti-cuts programme locally. If we hadn't have stood TUSC candidates, there wouldn't have been a crisis around the closure of a local swimming pool. Right across London, leisure centres are closing or being cut back. I'm from libraries. We've had 2 library closures in Waltham Forest. All the small libraries are closed twice a week. We've had 28 redundancies. In my area, we've had 700 job losses. If I recounted all the terrible things that have happened since 2010, it would be a pretty miserable story. So I want to concentrate my efforts on what we can do to try and stop the tide, if you like. So we stood candidates in Southampton. That forced the issue. And by standing candidates, that has had an effect inside the Labour Party in Hull, where you've had the rebel councillors in Hull. So it's obvious that some councillors are feeling the heat. And as Helen said, the motion that was put to Unison Conference, which was making overtures to supporting Labour councillors who don't vote for cuts, was very, very important. But what is the reality for people who actually vote against cuts? Because the fissure, if you like, the dividing line will be between those people who say, we are against cuts. Look at me, my heart's breaking as I vote to get rid of your job. I don't ideologically support it, but hey, what can I do about it? Because the dividing line will be, you are not going to put your hand up and vote for cuts. That's the position that we have to adopt going into 2014. Now, I've been told to sum up, and I would like to finish my remarks around what's been happening inside Unite, because it's very, very interesting. I mean, I'm a late comer to Twitter, and I recognise some people in the room who've had some Twitter spats with. But I've had quite lengthy spats with Owen Jones, with his position of getting ordinary union members to join the Labour Party, get candidates that are more working class, that are up for fighting the cuts. And if you think about it, Falkirk is the litmus test of that strategy. And you know, I lived through the witch hunts inside the Labour Party. I remember socialists and militant members being witch hunted out of the Labour Party. But never were the police called. The police weren't called in a way that's happened in Falkirk. It's absolutely disgusting the way the Labour Party hierarchy has responded to what's happened in Falkirk. And if you look at some of Len McCluskey's comments on the internet, there's a very interesting contribution that he makes, where he says, if I was to put out tomorrow, if I was to ask the membership of Unite, which I think is about 1.3 million people, if I was to ask the membership of Unite, do they support affiliation to Labour without a recommendation, then the overwhelming response would be no. Now, what does that tell you? What does that tell you about the feeling of the ranks of the Labour movement, particularly those in the public sector, previously like me? You speak to my old workmates, they're absolutely under the cosh. They're fearful of losing their jobs and their homes. They're working underneath bullying managers who don't let them go home on time, who make them work through their lunch hours, who give them laptops so that they're up all night doing reports, etc. No, I think that Falkirk really exposes that strategy of reclaiming Labour as a non-starter. I think that we need to turn outwards. We need to ask our class to represent itself. And I think that if we spend the next 6 months, we can build this list, this London list, these local lists, and we can attempt to get an electoral platform against cuts. Because as previous speakers have said, this strategy of waiting, and I will finish now, this strategy of waiting doesn't just mean that we wait and nothing happens. This strategy of waiting is a dangerous strategy, because into the void, into the silence, comes people like UKIP and the far right. It's not like we wait for a Labour government who we know is going to betray us and nothing happens in working class communities. That's not how it's playing out. It is right-wing disgruntled Tories who are voting for UKIP, but it's also disaffected Labour supporters who are completely disillusioned. So I would finish my remarks by saying, it's not just our aim that we should seek out our class to represent itself, it's our duty to protect them from the ideas of the far right. And so we do not enter a period like they've got in France, a Front National period, where they got traction in working class communities. Our aim is to stop that. We might be small, and as I've said in Waltham Forest, if we get to stand 60 candidates and they get 50 votes each, that's 3,000 votes going into the next election, into the next government, and that's a step forward for working class people.